There's one misconception about Ed Gein that needs to be corrected.
He's small, he's very diminutive stature. He doesn't appear to be threatening to anybody. They all are in agreement that he is psychotic. And they describe him as schizophrenic, which is clearly, I think, the case when you look at Ed Gein's history.
He looked like the kind of neighbor who'd help you fix a fence. Quiet, awkward, a little odd, but harmless. In a town of barely 700 people, you get used to quirks, but you don't expect horror. And certainly not the kind that steps out of a snow-dusted Wisconsin farmhouse on a November morning and literally changes true crime forever. And this is the rise and ruin of Ed Gein, Plainfield shy handyman whose name became shorthand for the macabre. A story about control and isolation, about a boy raised to fear the world and worship his mother, and what happens when grief, obsession, and fantasy finally snap. And we'll slow walk how he became what he became, why he hid in plain sight, and how small mistakes and mounting pressure finally pulled the mask off. So, let's get into it. Edmund Emil Gein was born on August 27, 1906 in La Crosse County, Wisconsin. His mother Augusta was devout, domineering, and convinced the world outside her Bible was rotting with sin. His father George drank and drifted from job to job. Between them, they built a home where shame was the oxygen. Augusta preached that women, except for herself of course, were instruments of temptation. Intercourse was filthy in her eyes, and desire a trap. She told Ed and his older brother Henry that the world would ruin them if they weren't careful, and then she made sure they were never allowed to be careless. They rarely socialized, and Augusta kept them isolated and drilled them with scripture, reminded Ed that he was weak and that only she knew the true path to salvation. When Ed was still a boy, the family left La Crosse for Plainfield, a lonely patch of central Wisconsin where winters bite and neighbors are separated by fields and tree lines. Augusta liked it there, and the fewer outsiders, the fewer sins to contend with. Ed liked it too because he liked whatever his mother liked. The lines of his world tightened around her. And from the jump, kids noticed he was different. He laughed at odd times, mimicked people. Shy, effeminate, and quick to blush. He tried to make friends, but lacked the rhythm of a normal conversation. He didn't date, of course, because in his house, women were either saints or demons, and the only saint was Mom. As he grew into his teens and 20s, the Gein farmhouse got smaller in a way that had nothing to do with walls. Augusta sealed rooms, in the parlor, her bedroom, reserving them like relics. The rest of the house, Ed's domain, fell into squalor. Newspapers piled up, tools and junk collected. Now, George died in 1940. The brothers took odd jobs around town to help pay the bills. And people hired Ed because he worked cheap and quiet, fixing fences, babysitting, and doing repairs. Weird but harmless, folks said. He never swore, never drank, and all the while, that house kept shrinking. On May 16th of 1944, a brush fire got away from the Gein brothers. Ed reported Henry missing. When authorities followed him through the marsh to the body, Henry was face down, dead at 43 years old. The official word was asphyxiation, but there were whispers. Bruises on the head, a scene that looked staged, as if Ed had led them straight to a body he already knew was there. Now we can't prove what happened in those flames, but what really matters is what Henry's death left behind. Augusta and Ed. No buffer or outside voices, just the saint and her disciple. And just 2 years later, Augusta died on December 29th of 1945, and Ed was shattered. And his mother had been his compass his entire life. Without her, the grief he felt wasn't just sadness, it was a complete loss of gravity. All alone at 39 years old, he sealed the good room she cherished for good and left the rest to rot. He slept near the kitchen stove like a child hiding from the dark. The farmhouse essentially became a shrine, and he, its caretaker. Without Augusta to define the world, Ed sought definitions in books and magazines. Anatomy, pulp horror, true detective rags, and clippings about surgical transformations. He read about grave robbing and taxidermy. He was searching for a shape he could wear that felt safe, something that resembled his mother, and something that muted his fear and isolation. So sometime around 1947, Ed began visiting cemeteries late at night. He targeted recent burials of middle-aged women who resembled Augusta. He said he went in a trance. He would dig, open the coffin, take what he wanted, and recover the grave so neatly that families didn't realize what had happened until police later exhumed and found coffins disturbed. He then brought parts back to the farmhouse: heads, skin, bones. He tanned hides the way a hunter might process a deer. He learned to preserve and shape skin into objects: masks on the wall, a vest stitched from a torso, leggings, gloves, a belt made from human nipples. He turned skull caps into bowls and fashioned chair seats from human hide. He was creating a costume, a woman's suit, if you will, that let him step into the feeling of being Augusta, if only for a moment. In town, people still saw the quiet handyman and the babysitter, the man who read the paper at the hardware store and kept to himself. But back in the farmhouse, the macabre museum was growing. On December 8th of 1954, Mary Hogan vanished from her tavern in nearby Pine Grove. Blood on the floor, a missing cash register, but no Mary. And for 3 years, it was an open wound in the community. Ed joked once that Mary was at his house, and his neighbor laughed. In plain sight is still out of sight if you look away fast enough. Then came November 16th of 1957. By then, the first snow had dusted Plainfield. Deer season was starting. Bernice Warden opened her hardware store early that day. A receipt was written that morning for antifreeze, the last entry she ever made. By afternoon, the store was empty, and blood led to the back, and her truck was gone. Her son, Deputy Sheriff Frank Warden, found the receipt and saw the name Ed Gein. Deputies headed for that farmhouse as the sun set and the cold dug in. What the officers saw that night still rattles the American imagination. In a shed off the farmhouse, Bernice Warden's body hung upside down from a pulley, dressed out like a deer. She had been shot, and the body was decapitated and eviscerated. Nearby in the house, they found a head and a sack, those skull caps used as bowls, masks of human facial skin hanging like grotesque portraits, boxes of bones, and several other preserved remains. This was an entire inventory of pieces of human beings, and it tore Plainfield out of the routine of deer season and dropped it into a horror no one had language for yet. Ed didn't run too far. When they picked him up, he seemed oddly relieved, like a man pulled out of water just before he went under the surface for good. At the interrogation table, he spoke softly as he always had, almost politely. He admitted to killing Bernice and admitted to grave robbing dozens of times, mostly at night, targeting fresh burials. He also admitted to the murder of Mary Hogan. About why he made the suit, he plainly said he wanted to become his mother, to crawl into her skin in the most literal way grief and obsession could invent. Investigators later exhumed graves and confirmed the pattern. Coffins disturbed and bodies tampered with. Not every grave he mentioned, but enough. Now, you can't talk about Ed Gein without discussing psychology, but you have to be careful. It's easy to sensationalize and slap labels that flatten a complicated story. What we do know is this: attachment and control. Augusta's moral absolutism and emotional domination turned women into a binary, holy or filthy, and left Ed with no template for adult intimacy. He could either worship or destroy. There was no in-between. And since his mother was the only woman he could worship, well, he searched for that missing intimacy by bringing her back to life in the best way he knew how. Isolation. That farmhouse functioned like a pressure cooker. Gein barely saw anyone and lived alone. That kind of isolation makes weird thoughts grow because nobody pushes back on them. After his mother died, he sealed off her rooms and kept them spotless, like a shrine. That was his way of pretending she was still in control and everything was proper. Meanwhile, the parts of the house he actually lived in fell apart. Trash everywhere, rot and filth. That shows his own life and mind were coming apart. And then there's compulsion. Sadistic killers get gratification from hurting and controlling a living victim. The pain and domination are the point. With Gein, the drive looks different. It's compulsive and ritualized, an urge to collect, carve, arrange, and wear objects the way a person with OCD feels forced to repeat a routine. The excitement is in assembling the scene, not in making somebody suffer. He withdrew from people and built a private world out of body parts and household items. Think of it like stage setting to recreate feelings tied to his mother and womanhood, a ritual to manage his inner chaos, not really a hunt for power over a resisting victim. There was the fantasy rehearsal aspect. Years of anatomy, taxidermy, and grave robbing stories turned taboo into a blueprint. You normalize what you practice, after all. So for Ed, he slowly graduated into what he became. It wasn't all at once. Now, none of this excuses anything he did, but it maps a mind raised to fear normal connection, and the result when locked in a room with that fear. Now, why didn't anyone catch him sooner? Well, there's two reasons for that: camouflage and complacency. In a small town, if you're useful and quiet, people look past your oddities. Simple as that. Ed fixed your fence, and he watched your kids. He didn't drink or yell. The guy got red in the face when you told him a dirty joke. And that polite and harmless mask stayed on throughout all this, and that's the camouflage. And complacency. Well, Mary Hogan's disappearance nagged at people, but it was a single case. Bernice Warden's disappearance triggered urgency because her son was law enforcement and because the receipt named a suspect. Until those lines crossed, the missing woman and the name in her handwriting, Ed sat in the blind spot of normalcy. There were tells, sealed rooms, trash heap living spaces, the offhand joke about Mary, and the way he lingered behind the counter to chat with Bernice. But in a place where winter is long and work is constant, you mind your business. That's how rural life survives. It's also how a predator hides. In custody, Gein was examined and declared legally insane. He was found incompetent to stand trial at first and committed to Central State Hospital in Waupun. Years later, doctors deemed him competent, and in 1968 he was tried for the murder of Bernice. The judge there found him guilty and then immediately ruled him not guilty by reason of insanity, sending him back, this time to Mendota Mental Health Institution in Madison. And that house where Ed lived and all this went down didn't wait for the verdict. It burned down in March of '58, just a year after the arrest, while it sat empty. Arson was suspected, and Plainfield had no appetite for memorials. At auction, the county sold what was recoverable, including Ed's old Ford, the one he used to haul bodies from cemeteries. A carnival operator bought that one and toured it as a sideshow. Gein spent the rest of his life behind hospital walls. He died on July 26, 1984, of respiratory failure due to cancer. He was buried back in Plainfield, not too far from the graves he disturbed. Ed Gein's crimes blew a hole in the American psyche. It was something we had never seen before and have rarely seen anything like it since. His story inspired fictional monsters like Norman Bates in Psycho, Leatherface in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs. Each one took a piece of the real horror: the mother fixation, the farmhouse workshop, and the suit of skin. Fiction exaggerated what fact already made unbearable. And yet, the real story is smaller and sadder. A lonely man in a collapsing house, building shrines to a mom he couldn't leave, and a womanhood he couldn't approach, turning grief into ritual and ritual into murder. In those final weeks before his arrest, tension hummed because a man who had hidden for a decade began to fray. Ed's money was thinning. He sold off most of the acreage, keeping the house in a small yard like a bunker. He spent more time around that hardware store. Deer season meant antifreeze, ammunition, and gloves. Reasons to linger and talk to Bernice Warden. He watched her and asked about prices. And the day before her disappearance, he again asked about antifreeze, making sure she'd be there early. He was planning this whole thing. That morning's receipt with his name was the mistake he couldn't take back. He'd always worked in the shadows, at night and in the quiet. The purchase he made was ordinary. The timing, however, was not. At the farmhouse, while his collections got bolder, the reality was each new object required more risk and invited discovery by anyone who made it through the door. But no one came by until it was the cops. You cover true crime long enough and certain patterns get familiar. Control, grievance, fantasy, opportunity. Ed Gein doesn't have the biggest body count, and he's certainly not the most sophisticated predator. But he's the convergence of those patterns with a cultural nerve ending. The place where American ideas about purity, motherhood, frontier isolation, and do-it-yourself pragmatism collide with untreated mental illness and obsession. We remember him because he forced us to picture what we don't want to imagine. Not just murder, but desecration. A man who looked ordinary while he crossed every boundary we rely on to feel safe. There's another reason why his story matters so much. He shows us exactly how an ordinary facade can be anything but. That horror wears overalls and does chores. It says, "ma'am," and keeps its head down. And when we say it can't happen here, we're remembering what was found in Augusta's parlor, but we're forgetting about the person laying on the kitchen floor. And that person can be anywhere in the country. This is the true crime saga of Ed Gein, how isolation and indoctrination can warp grief into ritual, and how a son's worship becomes a weapon when there's no one left to tell him where devotion ends. If you're into deep dive stories that trace not just the crimes but the psychology, the slow build and the little mistakes, well, hit subscribe. We do this every week, and for more cases that inspire the monsters of film and fiction, check the links below and our Patreon for extended cuts. Stay safe and take care of each other. And remember, it's always the quiet house at the end of the road, until one day it isn't.